Michelle's assistant asked me how the trip to Denver went, and I said, "What trip to Denver?" and I watched her face do something I'd spend the next 3 weeks trying to unsee. My name is Dan. I'm 44, I run the claims department at a regional insurance company in Columbus, and I'd been married to Michelle for 14 years when her assistant, a sharp 26-year-old named Priya, cornered me at the company's spring fundraiser holding 2 glasses of white wine and looking for my wife, who'd apparently wandered off to find the restroom. She said it went well, though, Priya continued, handing me one of the glasses since Michelle wasn't there to take it. The Denver trip. Did she tell you about the client dinner? Apparently the CFO loved her pitch. I have 2 kids, Sophie who was 11 that spring and Ben who was 8, and I have a job that trains you, over enough years, to keep your face perfectly still while someone tells you something that changes everything, because that's what you do when a claimant lies to you and you need them to keep talking. I used that training in that ballroom, holding a wine glass I didn't want, nodding like I already knew. She said it went great, I said. She downplays herself too much. Priya laughed, relieved, and moved on to someone else, and I stood there by a dessert table with 2 glasses of wine, one in each hand, trying to remember the last time Michelle had told me she was going to Denver. She hadn't. I would have remembered. I remember client dinners, I remember flight numbers, I remember the specific hotel she always requested near client sites because she liked having a gym on site. There had been no Denver trip on any calendar I'd seen, and Michelle and I still, after 14 years, kept a shared family calendar taped to the inside of the pantry door, the old-fashioned paper kind, because it was easier to see at a glance than opening an app. I found Michelle 20 minutes later near the bar, laughing at something a coworker said, and something about the ease of her laugh, the specific unguarded quality of it, made my stomach do something I didn't have a name for yet. We didn't talk about it that night. We drove home a little tipsy, the kids at my mother's for a sleepover, and Michelle fell asleep in the passenger seat with her head against the window, and I drove the rest of the way with the radio off, replaying Priya's question like a stone I couldn't stop turning over in my pocket. That's the shape of how this story starts, not with a scene, not with a discovery of lipstick on a collar or a hidden phone lighting up at 2 a.m., but with one sentence spoken by someone who had no idea she was handing me the loose thread that would eventually unravel 3 years of my life. I should tell you who I was before that night, because the man I was matters to how slowly all of this came apart. I've always been the kind of husband who trusts by default and calls it a virtue. 14 years, 2 kids, a mortgage on a house in Clintonville, we'd renovated ourselves room by room, I believed, without ever once testing the belief, that Michelle and I told each other the truth. I don't check phones. I've never once looked through her email. Some men would call that naive. For 14 years, I called it respect. Michelle worked hard, genuinely, visibly hard, as marketing director for a mid-size logistics firm downtown, the kind of job that occasionally demanded travel to trade shows and client meetings in cities I couldn't always keep straight. I never resented the travel. I coached Sophie's soccer team and handled Ben's homework and made dinner on the nights she flew home late, and it had always felt, to me, like a partnership working exactly the way it should. The morning after the fundraiser, I made coffee and stood at the pantry, looking at the calendar taped inside the door. March. April. I flipped back through the last several months, the way you'd flip through a photo album looking for one specific picture, and I found no Denver, no trip that matched what Priya had described, nothing at all in the timeframe her comment implied. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. A last-minute trip, forgotten in the chaos of a normal week, something she meant to add to the calendar and never got around to. I've spent most of my adult life being the kind of man who finds the generous explanation first, and that morning I found it easily, the way you find a coat you've worn 100 times, without even having to look. "Hey," I said, when Michelle came downstairs in her robe, hair still damp from the shower. "Priya mentioned a Denver trip last night." "I don't remember that one, when was that?" I watched her reach for the coffee pot before she answered, a beat too long, the kind of pause you'd only notice if you were already looking for something to notice. "Back in February," she said, pouring her coffee without turning around. 2-day thing, quick turnaround. I probably just forgot to write it on the calendar, it was such a whirlwind. February. I remembered February. I remembered a week where she'd told me she had back-to-back client meetings in Cincinnati, 3 hours south, close enough that she'd driven rather than flown, and I remembered, very specifically, because I'd made a joke about it, teasing her that she was becoming a road warrior. "I thought you were in Cincinnati that week," I said, keeping my voice light, the way you keep your voice light when you're testing weight on ice you're not sure will hold. "Cincinnati was the week before," she said, still not turning around. "Denver was after." I know it's confusing, it was a rough month. It wasn't confusing. It was, I understand now, the first small crack in a story that had been built, brick by brick, over roughly 3 years, a story so carefully maintained that a stray comment from an assistant who didn't know she was doing anything wrong was the only thing that finally let daylight in. I let it go that morning. Something tightened in my chest anyway, quietly, in a place I didn't examine. For the next several weeks, I told myself I'd imagined the significance of that whole exchange, and life went back to its usual rhythm: school drop-offs, Sophie's soccer practice, Ben's obsession with a video game I didn't understand, Michelle's laptop open on the kitchen counter most evenings, glowing blue against her face while she answered emails after the kids went to bed. But once you've noticed one crack in a wall, you start seeing hairlines everywhere, whether they're actually there or whether you're only now equipped to see what was always present. Michelle traveled more than I remembered her traveling in years past, or maybe she'd always traveled this much and I simply hadn't tracked it the way I found myself tracking it now. 2 nights in Nashville in April. A 3-day stretch in Charlotte in May that she described, in detail, as brutal, long days, bad hotel Wi-Fi, a client dinner that ran late. I didn't ask follow-up questions. Some part of me had already decided that asking too many questions would mean admitting I was looking for something. Something had shifted in me by then, and I couldn't name it, but every time her phone buzzed on the counter and she reached for it a half-second faster than she used to, I felt it tighten again, low in my stomach, like a rope pulled taut somewhere I couldn't see. She started keeping her phone face down on the nightstand, which she'd never done before, always used to leave it face up, unlocked half the time, no ceremony about it at all. Now it sat screen down, and once, when it buzzed at 11 at night while she was in the shower, I glanced at it out of habit and saw only a lock screen notification that read a single name, no last name, no preview text, because she'd apparently changed her settings to hide message content. I told myself this was reasonable. Everyone tightens their privacy settings eventually. I told myself this while standing in our bedroom at 11 at night holding my wife's phone, which is itself the kind of detail I'd have found suspicious in someone else's marriage and somehow managed not to find suspicious in my own. I didn't ask. Not because I didn't want to know, I want to be honest about this, because it's the flaw in me this whole story eventually forced me to look at, but because some part of me had already calculated, without putting it into words, that asking risked more than not asking. If I asked and there was nothing, I'd have insulted a woman who'd never given me a real reason to doubt her, over 14 years. If I asked and there was something, I'd have to actually do something about it. Silence felt, in the moment, like the responsible choice. It took me a long time afterward to understand that it wasn't responsibility at all. It was fear, dressed up as patience. Sophie, 11 and sharper than either of us gave her credit for, mentioned one evening at dinner that Mom always looks so tired lately, even when she smiles, a sentence she delivered the way kids deliver observations they don't fully understand the weight of, plainly, between bites of pasta, moving right on to a story about her friend Ava. I remember Michelle's fork pausing for exactly 1 beat before she laughed it off, said something about a big project at work, and changed the subject to Ben's book report. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever caught a detail in someone you love, a pause, a too quick answer, a habit that's changed without explanation, and told yourself it was nothing because the alternative felt too heavy to carry, you already know exactly what those months felt like from the inside. By June, Michelle had gone on 2 more trips, one to Indianapolis, one to a conference in Chicago, and both times, I noticed something small and specific. She called home earlier than usual on the first night away, almost performing the routine phone call, walking Sophie through her homework over speaker and asking Ben about his day in a voice that seemed, in hindsight, a half-degree too bright, too eager to prove that everything at home still mattered to her exactly as much as it always had. I noticed it. I filed it under "she misses the kids on the road, that's sweet," and I didn't examine why a woman who traveled for work for years without ever needing to overcompensate on phone calls had suddenly started needing to. One night in late June, after Michelle had gone up to bed early with what she said was a headache, I sat at the kitchen table with her laptop still open from an afternoon of remote work, and a browser tab caught my eye before I could stop myself from reading it, a flight confirmation email, subject line visible in the preview pane, for a trip to Denver in 3 weeks. Not Cincinnati. Not a client city she'd ever mentioned working with. Denver, again, the same city Priya had asked me about back in the spring. I didn't open the email. I closed the laptop, went to bed, and lay next to my sleeping wife for a long time, doing math I didn't want to be doing, trying to count how many work trips over the last 3 years I could actually verify, and coming up, disturbingly, short. By midsummer, the small inconsistencies had stopped feeling like isolated incidents and started feeling like a pattern I was actively avoiding naming, even to myself. I began, without quite admitting I was doing it, keeping a mental ledger. Denver, twice now that I knew of. A pattern of trips that never quite matched what she told me about client cities. Logistics firms in Columbus don't typically have major accounts in Denver, and when I'd mentioned this once, lightly, over dinner, Michelle had explained it as a new account we're trying to land. It's a whole thing, in a tone that closed the subject before I could ask a second question. I noticed she'd started working out more, not dramatically, but consistently, new running shoes appearing in the front closet, a gym bag she now kept in her car instead of at home. I noticed a new perfume on the coat she wore on travel days, something floral and expensive that she didn't wear around the house. I noticed she'd started, for the first time in our marriage, locking her phone with a passcode instead of the face unlock she'd used for years, and when I asked about it, casually, at breakfast, she said something about a work security policy update. IT had mandated it company-wide, and I nodded and let the sentence sit there, unverified, the way I'd let a dozen sentences sit there unverified over the preceding months. I didn't push. Not because the explanation satisfied me, it didn't, not really, but because pushing meant admitting, out loud, to myself and to her, that I no longer fully believed the story I was being told. And believing the story, even a story with holes in it, was easier than the alternative. One Thursday in July, Michelle mentioned, casually, over coffee, the way you mentioned something you've decided in advance is safe to mention, that she'd be flying to Denver again the following week, final push on that new account, 2 nights, back Saturday afternoon in time for Ben's baseball game. I said that sounded good. I did not say that I'd started, weeks earlier, quietly checking her travel history against our credit card statements, cross-referencing hotel charges against the cities she claimed, a project I'd been doing late at night after she'd gone to bed, telling myself I was just being organized about our finances. The credit card statements told a strange story of their own. Several hotel charges over the past year had come through under a corporate travel account I didn't have access to, which she explained, when I'd asked once, months earlier, as standard for business trips. The company booked and paid directly, nothing came out of our joint accounts. That explanation had satisfied me at the time. Now, looking at the pattern of it, I noticed that the corporate account trips clustered suspiciously around the cities that didn't match her stated client list, while the trips to cities that did match, the ones I could verify against actual accounts she managed, came through our joint card the normal way. I want to pause here, because if you've ever built a spreadsheet in the middle of the night to make sense of a story that used to feel simple, you already know the specific, lonely shame of doing that kind of work about someone you still love, someone who is still asleep upstairs, still your wife in every legal and practical sense, while you sit at the kitchen table quietly trying to prove she's lying to you. Ben, 8 years old and utterly without guile, asked me one evening while I was tucking him in why Mom smiles different on the phone with work than she smiles with us. I told him people sometimes have work faces, the same way he had a face for his teacher and a different face for me, and he seemed to accept that, rolling over and asking about dinosaurs instead, the way 8-year-olds redirect without warning. I lay awake a long time after that conversation, turning his observation over the way I'd turned over Priya's comment months before, another child noticing something the two adults around him were both, in their own ways, working hard not to say. Michelle's trip to Denver that July happened exactly as she described, 2 nights, back Saturday in time for Ben's game, and she showed up, tan and cheerful and full of stories about the client dinner and the new account, and she hugged Ben at home plate after his game with the kind of unguarded joy that made it almost impossible to hold on to my suspicion, because how do you reconcile that face, that laugh, with the spreadsheet sitting open on my laptop back home? That was the first time I truly started to doubt, not just the trips, but my own read on the whole shape of her, the woman I'd been married to for 14 years, because either I was wrong about all of it, or she was better at this than I wanted to believe a person I loved could be. I found, 3 days after that Denver trip, a receipt crumpled in the bottom of her travel bag while I was doing laundry, a restaurant charge for 2, dated the second night of her trip, at a steakhouse that billed itself, according to a quick search, as one of the most expensive dinners in downtown Denver, time-stamped at 9:47 p.m., well past any client dinner she'd described to me as wrapping early. Thank God. I was exhausted. I didn't confront her with it. I photographed it and put it back exactly where I found it, and I told myself, again, that I needed to know more before I said anything at all. August became, without my fully choosing it, an investigation. I want to be honest about what that looked like, because I think it says something true about the kind of husband I'd been for 14 years, and the kind of man fear turned me into over the following weeks. I started checking her corporate calendar, an old shared login from years earlier when we'd set up a family tech account together, one she'd apparently forgotten still had partial visibility into her work schedule. Most of it was blocked out as busy, uninformative, but a few entries had survived with visible titles, and one of them, dated for the coming September, read simply, D, flight confirmed, same hotel. D, I didn't yet know what D stood for. I told myself it could be a client name, a project code, anything at all. Some part of me, though, had already started building a shape around that letter, the same way you build a shape around a shadow before you've seen what's casting it. I found, going back through old emails on our shared family account, the one we still used for joint subscriptions and the kids' school portal, an old, half-forgotten thread from 3 years earlier where Michelle had CC'd me, apparently by accident, on an email meant for someone named Marcus Feld, a name I recognized vaguely as a business development director at a partner logistics firm in Denver, someone Michelle had mentioned once or twice, years back, as a good contact for a regional expansion project. The email itself was nothing, a scheduling logistics note, professional, unremarkable, but the name lodged itself in me the way Todd's name might lodge in another man's story, or the way any single proper noun can become, overnight, the center of everything. I searched Marcus Feld. Married, according to an old wedding announcement in a Denver paper, 2 young kids, a wife named Claire who ran a small photography business. He and Michelle had worked together, on and off, on a regional partnership project that had apparently started 3 years earlier, the same 3 years, I realized with a slow, sick recognition, that matched almost exactly the timeline of Michelle's sudden increase in unexplained travel. I understood something in that moment that I hadn't let myself understand before. This wasn't a recent lapse. This was a structure, built over years, load-bearing walls I'd been living inside without knowing they were there. There was a false lead in the middle of all this that nearly derailed me for a full week. A coworker of Michelle's, someone I'd met a handful of times at company events, mentioned to me at a neighborhood barbecue that Michelle had seemed stressed for months, ever since her dad's health scare, a detail I hadn't fully known about, and for several days I convinced myself that all of Michelle's odd behavior traced back to private worry about her aging father in Florida that she simply hadn't wanted to burden me with. I nearly let the whole investigation go, ashamed of myself for suspecting a woman quietly carrying a family fear alone. Then I called her father myself, under the pretense of checking in, and found him in perfectly ordinary health, mildly confused about why I was asking. The false lead cost me nearly a week and left me feeling, briefly, like the villain of this story rather than a man trying to find the truth. It also taught me something about how easily a half-true detail can talk you out of evidence you already have in hand. By late August, I had enough, not a full confession, not video or audio, but a paper trail that told a coherent story, a pattern of trips to cities that didn't match her client list, hotel charges routed conveniently around our joint accounts, a recurring D on a calendar I probably shouldn't have still had access to, and a name, Marcus, connected to almost exactly the timeline of every unexplained absence for the past 3 years. I printed it all. Flight confirmations. The restaurant receipt. A calendar screenshot. I put it in a plain folder and locked it in the bottom drawer of my desk at work, and I told myself I'd confront her calmly, once I had the last piece, one final trip, one final confirmation, so there'd be no room left for the explanation I half suspected she was already rehearsing. Sophie, one evening in late August, asked me, out of nowhere, while I was helping her with a math worksheet, whether Mom and I were doing okay, a question that startled me enough that I nearly dropped my pen. I asked her why she'd think otherwise. She shrugged, 11 years old, entirely too perceptive, and said, "You just seem far away lately. Both of you." I told her we were fine. I told her that a lot, that August, to a lot of people, including myself. Michelle's next trip to Denver was scheduled for the second week of September, 2 nights, the same hotel as before, according to the corporate calendar entry I probably shouldn't have still been able to see. I didn't wait for her to leave this time. I didn't wait for her to come back, either. I sat her down the night before her flight, after Sophie and Ben were asleep, in the kitchen where 14 years of our marriage's ordinary evenings had happened, and I put the folder on the table between us, closed, and I told her, calmly, that I needed her to look at what was inside before she got on that plane tomorrow. I want to describe how I felt in that moment, because it wasn't the rage I might have expected from myself, years earlier, imagining a scenario like this. It was something colder and more deliberate, the same steadiness I bring to a difficult claims case at work, where you lay the facts out one at a time and let them speak instead of raising your voice, because raising your voice only gives the other person room to make the conversation about your anger instead of about the truth. I opened the folder and turned it toward her. The flight confirmations. The hotel pattern. The restaurant receipt from July, timestamped 9:47 p.m. The calendar entry with the letter D. "I need you to explain this to me," I said. "All of it. Tonight. Before you get on a plane tomorrow to see him again." She looked at the papers for a long moment without touching them, and I watched her face do the specific work of deciding how much ground she could still hold. "This isn't, you're reading way more into a few work trips than there actually is," she said, and her voice had gone clipped, defensive in a register I'd rarely heard from her in 14 years. "The Denver account is real, Dan. Marcus is a business contact, that's it. You went through my calendar? My email? Do you understand how that looks?" "I understand exactly how it looks," I said. "That's why we're having this conversation." She shifted tactics within a breath, the way people do when the first wall gives out and they scramble for the next one. "One dinner doesn't mean anything. He took me to dinner because we were closing a deal, that's how business works, you know this, you've traveled for work. At 9:47 at night. At one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. On a trip you told me wrapped up early because you were exhausted." She went quiet for a moment, and then tried again, smaller this time. It isn't what you're building it into. It's not some 3-year thing, Dan, that's insane, that's not. The first flagged entry I found is from 3 years ago, I said, keeping my voice level, watching her face lose another degree of color. Marcus Feld. Denver Expansion Project. 3 years, Michelle. I sat there and watched a woman I had trusted completely for 14 years run out of places to stand, one printed page at a time, and there was no satisfaction in it at all. Just a very quiet, very total kind of grief, settling into the room like weather. She didn't break down. She didn't collapse into tears or confession. What she did, instead, was keep minimizing, softening each fact as I laid down the next one. It wasn't as often as it looked, it wasn't as serious as I was making it. He understood her in ways that had nothing to do with our marriage being broken. It was never about leaving the kids, never about leaving this life, just something that had started small and never fully stopped. I need you to actually hear yourself, I said, finally, quietly. You're not denying it anymore. You're just trying to make it smaller. She stopped. For the first time all evening, she didn't have a next sentence ready. I need time to think about how to actually talk about this properly, she said, eventually, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. Not like this. Not with you throwing evidence at me like I'm a suspect. You are a suspect, I said. You made yourself one, 3 years ago. She didn't go to Denver the next morning. She called in sick to work, something I don't think she'd done in a decade, and we spent that day in a strange, exhausted silence, both of us aware that whatever came next would need to be more than a reaction to being caught. She came to me 4 days later, on a Sunday afternoon while the kids were at my mother's, and asked if she could finally tell me everything, start to finish, without me interrupting until she was done. She finally spoke. This is what she told me. It started 3 years ago, on the very first Denver trip, the one that was actually just business, nothing else. Marcus and I worked late finalizing the account details, and we ended up getting drinks afterward, and it felt easy in a way that things at home hadn't felt easy in a long time, not because of anything you'd done wrong, Dan, I want to say that clearly, but because somewhere in the last few years of raising the kids and running the house, I'd stopped feeling like a person people found interesting, and just started feeling like a role I performed. Marcus asked me questions and actually waited for the answers. Nothing happened that first trip, I want you to know that, even though I know it barely matters now. It happened the second trip, 2 months later, and I told myself it was a one-time thing, a mistake born out of loneliness I hadn't even admitted to myself I was carrying. Then there was a third trip, and a fourth, and every single time I told myself this was the last one, that I'd end it quietly and no one would ever need to know, and every single time I found a reason it needed to continue a little longer. I built the whole thing so carefully, the corporate travel account, the vague client explanations, the calendar entries I thought no one could see, because some part of me had decided that as long as you never actually found out, I hadn't really broken anything that couldn't be repaired quietly, alone, in my own head. I was terrified constantly. I couldn't look at pictures of our wedding on the hallway wall some mornings. I stopped being able to look Sophie in the eye for almost a full day after that Denver dinner in July, because she'd asked me, completely innocently, if I'd bought her a souvenir, and I hadn't even thought to buy one, because I hadn't been thinking about her at all that weekend. I tried to end it in the spring, after Priya's comment at the fundraiser. I panicked for weeks after that, certain you already knew, and I did stop, for almost 2 months, and then I let it start again in July, telling myself, again, that this really would be the last time. I don't have a version of this that makes it smaller than it was. I just have the truth, finally, and I'm sorry it took you finding a folder full of evidence to get it out of me instead of me simply telling you myself. I listened to all of it without interrupting, the way I'd promised her I would, and when she finished, I didn't feel the relief people sometimes describe when a long-buried truth finally surfaces whole. I felt the specific, settled weight of having a suspicion confirmed in full, with none of the doubt left to hide inside. I understood, sitting in that quiet kitchen, that I hadn't been maintaining a marriage for at least the last several years. I'd been maintaining an assumption, and calling the assumption a marriage, because examining it too closely had always felt like more risk than I was willing to take. Marcus's part in it unraveled in the weeks that followed, mostly through channels neither of us controlled. His wife, Claire, found out roughly 2 weeks after our own confrontation, through an anonymous message I never sent and never traced, though I suspect, to this day, it may have come from Priya, who I think had begun putting pieces together herself once she understood what her offhand comment at the fundraiser had actually set in motion. Claire filed for divorce within the month. Marcus lost his marriage, lost joint custody arrangements that clearly devastated him in ways I found, to my own surprise, that I didn't take any pleasure in, and lost, according to a mutual industry contact of Michelle's, several key professional relationships once word moved through their small regional business circle about the affair and its collateral damage. Michelle lost more than the affair itself. She lost the version of herself she'd spent 3 years protecting, a woman who told herself she'd never actually break anything, right up until the moment the evidence made that story impossible to keep telling. She lost my trust completely, in a way that no amount of counseling, which we did attempt, briefly, that fall, could rebuild. She lost, eventually, the marriage. I filed for divorce in October. I want to be honest that I didn't do it from a place of clean, composed peace. There were nights that fall where the anger came back in full, ugly waves, where I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside and be a calm father for 2 kids who needed one. But underneath the anger, once it had burned down enough to see past it, was something clearer. I understood that I could love Sophie and Ben with everything I had, permanently and unconditionally, while also knowing I could not keep sharing a house with the specific shape of what Michelle had built and hidden for 3 years. The divorce settlement, when it came through the following spring, left me with the house in Clintonville, primary custody with Michelle having the kids every other weekend, and a settlement that reflected, plainly, whose actions had caused the marriage's collapse. I didn't fight for those terms out of vengeance. I fought for them because I understood, for the first time in 14 years, that protecting my own interests wasn't cruelty, it was something I'd simply never practiced before. I told Sophie and Ben, over the following months, in pieces appropriate to their ages, that grown-ups sometimes make choices that hurt the people who love them, and that none of what happened was in any way their fault, and that I would be there for every single day of both their lives regardless of anything else that had changed. Sophie, 12 by then, asked me once if I still loved Mom. I told her love doesn't always mean staying, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your kids is show them what it looks like to protect yourself with dignity. I coach Ben's baseball team now. I still make dinner most nights. Michelle and I are civil, mostly, in the careful way divorced parents learn to be civil, trading the kids at soccer practice and school events without much friction left between us. I don't know if she and Marcus ever spoke again after everything fell apart on both sides. I've never asked, and some part of me has stopped needing to know. The most painful detail in this whole story isn't the affair itself, it's the 3 years of careful architecture it took to sustain it, one small, deliberate omission at a time, until an offhand comment from someone who had no idea what she was doing finally let the whole structure show its cracks. Michelle didn't tell one lie. She built a system that could survive years of ordinary scrutiny, and it worked, right up until the moment a coincidence she couldn't have controlled walked up to me holding a glass of wine. What this reveals about trust, I think, is something more specific than the usual advice to trust your gut. Trust that goes untested for years isn't automatically strength. Sometimes it's simply 2 people, independently, deciding that examining the structure too closely risks more than either of them is ready to lose. I didn't ask hard questions for months because asking risked confirming something I preferred not to know. Michelle didn't stop for 3 years because stopping meant confronting a version of her own unhappiness she'd rather manage quietly than say out loud. We built, without either of us fully choosing to, a home resting on 2 separate silences that happened to align, until one person outside either silence said something true without knowing what she was setting in motion. I've come to understand, in the 2 years since, that the real turning point in this story wasn't the folder on the kitchen table. It was months earlier, at that fundraiser, when I decided the easier path was not asking a follow-up question I already half suspected I wouldn't like the answer to. That choice cost me months of additional pain, and I've had to sit with the fact that some of that delay was mine to own, even though none of the underlying betrayal was. If there's a harder question underneath all of this, it's not really about Michelle, or even about Marcus, who lost as much as anyone by choosing silence for his own reasons. It's this: how much of what we call trust in our daily lives is actually just a preference for not finding out we were wrong to give it? I don't think that question has a comfortable answer, and I'm not sure it needs one to still be worth asking yourself honestly. I think about Priya sometimes, Michelle's assistant, a woman I've probably spoken to a total of 10 times in my life, who asked one innocent question at a work party and had no idea she was handing me the first loose thread of something that had been quietly unraveling for 3 years already. I don't think she'll ever know what that question set in motion. I'm not sure I'd know how to explain it to her even if I tried. What hurts most, if I'm honest, isn't that Michelle had an affair. People are flawed, marriages strain. I understand that in the abstract better now than I did before any of this happened. What hurts is realizing how easily 3 years can pass inside a story that isn't true, if both people involved are careful enough, and afraid enough, to keep the story standing. I don't know if you've ever built something on a silence you never tested, or noticed a small inconsistency and decided the peace of not asking was worth more than the risk of an honest answer. Most of us have, somewhere, in some form. I hope, if you're carrying one right now, that whatever's underneath it gets found out gently, by someone who still has enough love left over to help you rebuild. If you've got one word for someone who let you down, or a moment you chose not to look closely at a red flag you already half saw, I'd like to hear it in the comments. And thank you for staying with this one all the way through. Some of us needed a long time to be able to say it out loud at all.